3,520 yards. 2 miles of shifting crosswinds, thin mountain air, and the literal curvature of the earth. In her earpiece, the commander's voice was flat, metallic, and final. "It's outside the envelope. Abort." Cross didn't touch her radio. She just settled her cheek against the freezing rifle stock. The hide smelled like ammonia, old sweat, and crushed sage. For 72 hours, Riley Cross had been lying on a slab of jagged shale that felt less like a tactical vantage point and more like a medieval torture rack. Her sternum ached with a dull, persistent throb from supporting her own body weight, and her left leg had gone numb sometime around midnight. The wind howled through the narrow mountain pass, a constant, abrasive hiss that carried the biting cold directly through the seams of her insulated gear. She could feel the grit in her teeth. It tasted like chalk and dried blood from a cracked lip she couldn't stop biting. Beside her, Russo was a lump of dirt-caked canvas and muted breathing. He hadn't spoken a complete sentence in 14 hours. The only proof he was still alive and awake was the slow, rhythmic sweep of his spotting scope and the faint, sour smell of wintergreen chewing tobacco that wafted over whenever the wind died down for a fraction of a second. They were a team in the way 2 starving dogs chained to the same fence were a team, bound by circumstance, mutual suffering, and a shared, singular focus on the dirt road winding through the valley floor beneath them. The mission had been simple on paper, drafted by officers sitting in air-conditioned tents, breathing filtered oxygen. In reality, it was a slow degradation of the human body. Cross pressed her face against the cheek rest of her .50 caliber rifle. The metal was brutally cold, drawing the heat out of her skin. She blinked, forcing the sluggish moisture back into her eyes. The reticle in her optic floated over the barren landscape, a precise black crosshair superimposed over a chaotic world of grey rocks and brown dust. A crackle of static broke the vast, empty silence. The radio on Russo's chest rig whispered, "Viper 2, this is command. We have movement on the objective. 2 vehicles approaching from the north. Confirm visual." It was Stanton. His voice was too clean, too rested. Cross felt a flare of irrational, exhausted anger. She swallowed dryly, her throat clicking. Russo shifted, his movements agonizingly slow, bringing his heavy optics to bear on the northern ridge. "Got 'em," Russo murmured, his voice a gravelly rasp. 2 black SUVs coming down the switchback. Cross adjusted her position by a millimeter. The shale dug into her ribs. She dragged the heavy rifle slightly to the left, tracking the distant plumes of dust. Through the magnified glass, the vehicles looked like slow-moving beetles crawling across a massive, wrinkled blanket. She dialed up the magnification. The mirage, the heat waves rising off the cold stone as the morning sun hit it, made the vehicles shimmer and distort, dancing in her vision like ghosts. "Distance," Cross whispered. Russo was silent for a long moment. She could hear the faint click of his laser rangefinder, the quiet hum of his ballistic computer being roused from sleep mode. 3,520 yards, Russo said. There was no inflection in his voice. He was stating a fact, but the weight of the number hung in the freezing air between them. 2 miles. Cross closed her eyes. A headache, sharp and localized right behind her temples, pulsed in time with her heart. A shot at that distance wasn't just marksmanship. It was a calculus problem with too many variables and a margin of error measured in fractions of an inch. The bullet would be in the air for over 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, the Earth would physically rotate beneath the projectile. Gravity would pull it down in a massive, sweeping arc. The wind, which was currently blowing left to right at their position, might be blowing right to left halfway down the valley, and gusting upward near the target. "Command Viper 2, Russo transmitted softly. "Visual confirmed. Target Keller is likely in the lead vehicle. Range is 3520. A pause. The static hissed. Cross watched the lead SUV roll to a stop near a cluster of ruined mud brick walls. A figure stepped out. Even at this distance, magnified through layers of expensive glass, he was just a blur of dark clothing. But the profile matched. Keller, the man who had brokered the deaths of 42 people in a market square 2 months ago, acting like he was just taking a morning stroll in the Badlands. "Viper 2, this is command." Stanton's voice returned, sharper this time. "Confirm range. Did you say 3,500? "Affirmative, command," Russo replied. "That's outside the envelope, Viper 2. Max effective for your platform is 1,000 yards short of that. Wind shear is unpredictable in that corridor. You are not clear to engage. Abort, break down your hide, and proceed to extraction." Cross opened her eyes. The crosshairs rested on the blurry figure standing by the SUV. She felt the heavy, sluggish thud of her own pulse in her neck. Her fingers were stiff, the joints aching from the cold. If she squeezed the trigger, she wasn't just fighting the wind, the drop, and the spin of the earth. She was fighting her own failing biology. "Did you hear him?" Russo asked quietly, not looking away from his spotting scope. "I heard him," Cross said. Her voice sounded thin, alien to her own ears. She looked at her hand, resting near the trigger guard. There was dirt caked under her fingernails. Her knuckles were scarred and dry. She thought about the 3 days they had spent lying in their own filth on this rock, freezing, cramping, pissing into plastic bags. She thought about the clean, sterile operations room where Stanton was currently standing, probably holding a cup of hot coffee. The contradiction of it gnawed at her. She wasn't an action hero. She didn't feel a surge of righteous fury or a cold, calculated determination. She just felt deeply, profoundly tired and overwhelmingly stubborn. "He said abort," Russo whispered. It wasn't a warning. It was an observation. Russo didn't care about Stanton any more than she did, but he was a mathematician of death, and the math was currently laughing in their faces. "Give me the wind, Russo," Cross said. Russo didn't argue. He didn't sigh. The heavy silence stretched for 2 seconds before he leaned closer to his glass. "You're looking at a full-value crosswind at the muzzle, 10 miles an hour, left to right. But down in the valley..." Russo paused, his eye glued to the scope, reading the faint disturbances in the mirage and the way the sparse brush twitched 2 miles away. "It's a blender. I'm seeing right to left at mid-flight, maybe 6 miles an hour. Then it dies at the target. Thermal updraft off that canyon wall." Cross's brain ground through the numbers, fighting through the fog of exhaustion. She reached up and began twisting the elevation turret on her scope. Click, click, click. The sound was sharp and metallic. She dialed in so much elevation that she was practically aiming at the sky. She had to compensate for over 400 inches of bullet drop. The scope was pitched so high that she had to adjust her cheek weld just to see through the glass. "Coriolis?" she asked, her breathing going shallow. "Earth's rotating toward the target. You need to hold under," Russo muttered, typing furiously on his small weather meter. "And spindrift is going to push you right. Add it all up. I need you to hold 142 MOA up. Hold left 4.5 mils. Cross shifted the rifle. The crosshairs moved completely off the target. She was now aiming at a blank piece of dirt on the hillside, high above and far to the left of where Keller was standing. It felt entirely wrong. Every instinct in her body, honed by thousands of rounds downrange, screamed that she was aiming at nothing. She was trusting invisible math over her own eyes. "Send it," Russo said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible frequency. Cross settled her finger onto the cold curve of the trigger. She didn't hold her breath like they do in the movies. That only starves the brain of oxygen and causes muscle tremors. She just let her lungs naturally deflate, finding the natural respiratory pause. Her heart gave a hard, uneven thud against the shale. She felt a cramp threatening to seize her right calf. She ignored it. She focused entirely on the pressure on her index finger. 3 pounds of pressure. She added 1 pound. 2. The rifle surprised her when it broke. Crack! The violent concussion tore through the silence of the mountain pass. A massive jet of fire and overpressure kicked up a cloud of pulverized rock and dust around them. The massive recoil drove the buttstock into Cross's shoulder like a hammer blow, bruising her collarbone instantly. The muzzle brake violently redirected the expanding gases, rattling her teeth in her skull and leaving a high-pitched whine ringing in her ears, despite her ear protection. Cross didn't blink. She fought the recoil, forcing her eye to stay right behind the scope, staring through the swirling dust. "Good trace," Russo said instantly. The heavy 750-grain brass solid bullet was moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second, ripping through the thin air. But 2 miles is a vast expanse. 1 second. Cross felt a bead of sweat break loose from her hairline and slide down the bridge of her nose. 2 seconds. The target, Keller, hadn't moved. The sound of the gunshot was still miles away from him, traveling slower than the bullet. To him, the world was completely silent. 3 seconds. Cross's lungs burned. She realized she was holding her breath now. She desperately wanted to blink. The mirage danced, blurring the image of the SUV. 4 seconds. The bullet was dropping out of the sky now, losing velocity, succumbing to gravity, plunging downward in a steep, plunging arc. 4.5 seconds. Through the glass, Cross saw the violent kinetic impact before she registered anything else. It wasn't clean. It wasn't a neat, cinematic event. The figure standing by the SUV simply ceased to be a standing figure. A chaotic spray of red and grey mist erupted against the side of the black vehicle. The body was thrown backward with brutal, unnatural force, collapsing into the dust like a dropped sack of wet laundry. A full second later, the men around the SUV panicked, diving for cover. Weapons raised toward the hills, completely unaware of where the death had come from. Russo exhaled slowly. "Impact! Target is down! Center mass!" Cross finally blinked. Her eye burned fiercely. She didn't feel triumphant. There was no surge of adrenaline, no fist pumping, no sense of profound justice. The headache behind her temples flared into a blinding throb, and the cramp in her right calf finally seized, twisting her muscle into a knot of agonizing pain. She rolled away from the rifle onto her back, staring up at the pale, indifferent sky. She smelled the bitter, acrid stench of burnt gunpowder mixing with the dirt. The radio on Russo's chest hissed again. Stanton's voice, frantic and sharp. "Viper 2. I heard a crack on open comms. Report. I gave a direct order to abort." Russo looked down at Cross. She was grimacing, rubbing her knotted calf with a dirty, trembling hand, looking perfectly miserable. Russo keyed his mic. "Command, Viper 2. Wind shifted, requesting extraction coordinates." He paused, a faint, cynical smirk touching the corner of his cracked lips. "Target neutralized." Cross closed her eyes, the cold stone seeping back into her bones. She just wanted a hot shower. The extraction was never the glorious part. It was just the bill coming due. Breaking down the hide took 12 agonizing minutes. Cross's fingers were stiff, clumsy blocks of meat. Pushing the takedown pins out of the .50 caliber rifle felt like trying to manipulate ball bearings with pliers. The metal of the receiver was still freezing, despite the explosive heat that had just rocketed through its barrel. She collapsed the stock, the carbon fiber grating against the shale, and shoved the heavy components into her drag bag. Every movement was a negotiation with her own failing joints. The cramp in her calf had receded into a dull, hot ache, but her knees felt completely hollowed out, as if the cartilage had been replaced with crushed glass. "Movement in the valley," Russo said softly. He had already packed his spotting scope and was currently scanning the distant terrain through his rifle's optic. 3 miles out, coming from the east. Technicals. They're looking for the source. "Let them look," Cross muttered, hauling her 70-pound pack onto her shoulders. The weight hit her spine like an anvil. She swayed, her boots slipping slightly on the loose rock, before her core engaged, locking her center of gravity into place. She smelled herself, a rancid, sharp odor of stale sweat, tactical nylon, and the distinct metallic tang of adrenaline that was already beginning to sour in her system. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. They turned their backs on the valley and began the long, brutal descent toward the secondary extraction point. The terrain was a nightmare of jagged ravines and dry creek beds. Going down was always worse than going up. Gravity forced the entire weight of her pack directly onto her knees and ankles with every step. The shale shifted beneath her boots, requiring a constant, exhausting micro-balancing act. Her thighs burned, the lactic acid pooling deep in the muscle fibers. The wind, which had been a freezing enemy on the ridge, died completely as they dropped into a narrow draw. Now, the sun beat down on the trapped air, baking the canyon walls. Within 20 minutes, the freezing chill was replaced by a stifling, oppressive heat. Sweat stung her eyes. Cross reached for the bite valve of her hydration bladder, clamping her cracked lips around the rubber. The water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of plastic and iodine. She swallowed just enough to wet her throat, rationing it by instinct. Behind her, she heard the rhythmic, heavy crunch of Russo's boots. He was a ghost, leaving almost no trace, but she could hear his labored breathing. They were both running on fumes, surviving purely on the stubborn refusal to stop putting one foot in front of the other. An hour passed, then 2. The canyons twisted, the rock walls painted in harsh, blinding shades of rust and ochre. Cross's mind began to detach from her body, a necessary survival mechanism. She stopped feeling the pain in her shoulders, the blisters forming on her heels. Her vision narrowed to the 6 feet of dirt directly in front of her. She watched a scorpion scuttle backward under a rock, its tail raised in a desperate threat display. She stepped over it carefully, her brain barely registering the movement. The radio earpiece remained completely silent. Stanton was making them sweat. He had given them the extraction grid, but he wasn't offering any updates on the enemy movement in the valley. It was a petty, bureaucratic flex, a reminder that he controlled the board. Cross felt a flicker of cynical amusement cut through her exhaustion. Stanton could sit in his air-conditioned tactical operations center all he wanted. He couldn't unpull the trigger. "Hold," Russo hissed. Cross froze instantly. She didn't drop to a knee. The extra movement would take too much energy to recover from. She just turned into a statue, her hand drifting toward the grip of her sidearm. "Halo," Russo said, looking up at the narrow sliver of blue sky visible between the canyon walls. A moment later, Cross felt it. It wasn't a sound at first, but a deep, rhythmic thumping in her chest cavity. Then the sound hit them, the deafening, violent chopping of rotor blades tearing through the thin mountain air. A shadow swept over the canyon. "Comms are up," Russo said, tapping his headset. "Inbound, 2 minutes." They pushed forward, breaking into a heavy, shambling jog as the canyon widened out into a flat, dusty plateau. The heat off the deck was intense, shimmering in waves. Then, banking hard over the southern ridge, the dark green silhouette of an MH-60 Blackhawk flared its nose, its massive rotors kicking up a blinding, choking cloud of brown dust and pulverized vegetation. Cross turned her face away, squinting through the sandstorm as the aircraft touched down hard, the suspension compressing violently. The smell of burning aviation fuel, a sweet, toxic odor of JP-8, flooded her nostrils. The side door slid open, and the crew chief, wearing a heavy helmet and reflective visor, leaned out, waving them in frantically. Cross didn't run. She just walked, a slow, deliberate march through the hurricane of rotor wash. She grabbed the edge of the cabin floor, her gloves slipping slightly on the worn metal, and hauled herself inside. Russo tumbled in right behind her. Before they were even strapped in, the deck tilted sharply. The helicopter tore itself away from the earth, banking into a steep climb. Cross slumped against the nylon webbing of the troop seat. She didn't look out the window. She stared at the scratched metal floorboards, her ears ringing beneath her headset, her body vibrating with the violent mechanical rhythm of the aircraft. She closed her eyes. The dark wasn't peaceful. It was filled with the afterimage of a crosshair, the harsh glare of mirage, and the sudden chaotic burst of red mist. The forward operating base smelled like bleach, burnt coffee, and diesel exhaust. It was an assault on the senses after 3 days of breathing nothing but high-altitude sage and dirt. Cross walked across the tarmac, the concrete feeling unnaturally flat beneath her boots. Her legs were dead wood. She carried her heavy rifle bag by the reinforced handle, dragging it slightly because her shoulder simply refused to bear the weight anymore. The sun was going down, casting long, distorted shadows across the rows of modular shipping containers that made up the command center. "They're waiting," Russo said softly, breaking a 2-hour silence. He nodded toward the largest structure, a reinforced bunker bristling with communication antennas. "Let them," Cross said. Her voice sounded gravelly, like she had swallowed sand. They didn't go to the armory. They didn't go to the showers. They walked straight into the tactical operations center. The air conditioning hit Cross like a physical wall. It was 50 degrees cooler inside, and the sudden temperature shift made her teeth chatter uncontrollably for a second before she clamped her jaw shut. The room was bathed in harsh, blue-white fluorescent light that made everyone look like a corpse. Dozens of glowing monitors lined the walls, displaying drone feeds, topographical maps, and signal intercepts. In the center of the room, standing behind a digital map table, was Commander Stanton. He was impeccable. His uniform was crisp, the sleeves rolled precisely to the mid-forearm. He smelled faintly of expensive aftershave and peppermint gum. He looked up as Cross and Russo entered, and the entire room went completely, deadeningly quiet. Operators, intelligence analysts, and communications techs stopped what they were doing, their eyes darting between the 2 snipers and the commander. Cross stopped 3 feet from the table. She didn't salute. She just stood there, swaying slightly, dirt caking her face like a mask, her eyes sunken into deep, bruised hollows. She knew she looked like a stray dog that had been dragged behind a truck. Stanton stared at her, his jaw muscles flexed, a tight, controlled rhythm. "I gave you a direct, unencoded order to abort," Stanton said. His voice was low, perfectly modulated, but vibrating with barely suppressed fury. "You were outside the operational envelope. You risked compromise of the entire sector for a low-percentage vanity shot." Cross looked at him. She didn't feel angry. She just felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of apathy. She looked at his clean hands, resting on the edges of the digital map. "The wind died," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying zero emotion. Stanton's eyes narrowed. "That is not an excuse for insubordination. If you had missed, you would have alerted an entire valley of hostile combatants to our presence without neutralizing the high-value target. You operated entirely outside protocol." "But she didn't miss," Russo interjected softly from her left. Stanton shot Russo a venomous look, but he didn't verbally snap back. That was the trap, and everyone in the room knew it. The shot was impossible, the insubordination was blatant, but the result was undeniable. Keller was dead. The network he controlled was already fractured. Stanton couldn't court-martial them without admitting they had pulled off the most mathematically absurd kinetic strike of the deployment. It would make him look rigid, foolish. He needed the win on his operational record just as much as he hated how he got it. The silence stretched. The hum of the massive server racks filled the void. Cross felt a drop of sweat break loose from her filthy hairline, carve a pale track down her cheek, and drip off her chin onto the immaculate floor. "Get out of my TOC," Stanton finally said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Write up the after-action report. You're grounded until further notice." Cross didn't nod. She didn't say, "Yes, sir." She just turned around, her boots squeaking faintly on the linoleum, and walked out back into the fading desert heat. 30 minutes later, she was sitting on the edge of a narrow canvas cot in her housing unit. The room was entirely dark, except for the amber glow of a small power strip in the corner. She reached down, her fingers fumbling with the thick, dust-caked laces of her left boot. She managed to yank the knot free, pulling the heavy leather off her foot. The smell of damp, sour wool and foot powder filled the small space. She peeled her sock off. Her heel was a mess of raw, weeping blisters, the skin peeled back in angry red layers. She stared at her foot for a long time, the pain a distant, buzzing static in the back of her brain. She had made a shot that sniper instructors would talk about for decades. A shot that defied ballistics, weather, and common sense. A shot that killed a monster from 2 miles away. But sitting in the dark, breathing in the stale air of a plywood box in the middle of nowhere, there was no glory. There was no sweeping orchestral music or profound sense of closure. There was just the dull throb in her shoulder, the raw skin on her heels, and the deep, inescapable knowledge that tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, they would send her back out to find another patch of jagged rock to lie on. Cross lay back on the thin, lumpy mattress. She didn't even have the energy to take off the other boot. She just closed her eyes, listening to the faint, unending hiss of the wind blowing against the corrugated metal roof. If this raw look at the grit, math, and grueling reality of being a SEAL sniper kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. We don't do Hollywood fairy tales here. We bring you the authentic, uncompromising stories from the edge of human endurance. Share this video with someone who respects the silent professionals, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, tactical storytelling every single week. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the shot?